While the Soviet leaders wanted their mummified bodies to be put in the mausoleum, I do believe that Putin succeeded to mummify the body of Russia itself.
Hello and welcome to the GZERO World Podcast. This is where you'll find extended versions of my interviews on public television. I'm Ivan Bremmer, and today we look at Vladimir Putin's military campaign in Ukraine after 2 months of bloodshed. Where does the conflict go from here, and how much more human tragedy is on the horizon before peace can possibly be realized? This week, I speak with political scientist and renowned Russia expert Ivan Krastev. He's written extensively about the state of play in Ukraine. Let's do this.
The GZERO World Podcast is brought to you by our founding sponsor, First Republic. First Republic, a private bank and wealth management company, understands the value of service, safety, and stability in today's uncertain world. Visit firstrepublic.com to learn more. GZERO World would also like to share a message from our friends at Foreign Policy. Challenge yourself to change the world on Season 3 of Course Correction, a podcast from Doha Debates in partnership with the UNHCR Refugee Agency. Host Nelifar Hedayet takes listeners on the journey of a refugee, from the moment of displacement to mental health risks, to integration and assimilation. Learn about the issues affecting displaced persons around the world and what you can do to solve them. Follow and listen to Course Correction wherever you get your podcasts.
Ivan Krastev, welcome to GZERO World.
Thank you very much for inviting.
So I want to start with the obvious question, because from my perspective, I look at what we've seen over the last couple months, and I see the biggest miscalculation made by a major leader on the global stage since the Soviet Union has collapsed. Do you agree with that? Do you think that that is true in terms of Putin's decision to invade Ukraine? And to the extent that you do, why do you think he made that mistake?
I do believe he miscalculated. But his miscalculation cannot be easily explained simply because of a poor intelligence or basically poor performance of the Russian troops on the ground. In my view, miscalculation goes very much deeper to the way how sees the world after the end of the Cold War and what is happening there. And here there are three things that in my view works very much to explain why he did what he did. One is he never took the end of the Soviet Union as a natural result of the end of the communism. For him, the fact that communism was over was not a bad news, but he could not understand how it is possible that nuclear power can lose his sovereignty and basically lose its state. So from this point of view, restoring historic Russia was something that was always for him the most important thing to happen. To do this, he totally mistook and misunderstood the nature of the Russian state and the Soviet Union before. So when he said that the Russians and Ukrainians are the same people, he believed it. And this was a major miscalculation. Secondly, and in my view, this is also important for him, he really believes that the West in such a deep crisis that the West is impossible to react, that the West was going to tolerate. Nevertheless, that it is not going to like what he did. But this is the problem of time. He created a system which is so much around him. It's so much a personalized regime that he wants to fix all the problems that Russia is facing in his lifetime. He mistrusts the world, but also he mistrusts his successors. This is why the idea that the time is not on his side, in my view, very much defined the fact that he wanted to do it now, wanted to do it quickly, and basically he wanted this historic Russia that he was imagining to happen while he's still in his strengths. So all these three things led to what we see today, and I agree very much with you. This is a miscalculation, and even now, he knows that it doesn't work in the way he expected it to do. I'm not sure that he understands that the problems that he's facing are not just the result of kind of accidental factors on the ground.
Do you think he understands how badly it is going for him. And I don't just mean in terms of, is he getting correct information in terms of the military on the ground and their losses and the poor morale and how badly prepared they were and all the rest. Is he receiving an objective view of how the military is going? But also, do you think he understands how the permanence of the damage that's been done in terms of Russia's relationship with the West, which did hold a lot of importance for Putin and for Russia over the past 30 years?
Listen, he understands certain things, and obviously he's angry, and obviously he's very unhappy with what is happening on the ground. But according to him, and this is now for more than a decade, he believes that he's in a war with the West. So for him, the breaking with the West is not the news. In his own understanding of the world, the West is trying to weaken Russia. The West is trying to weaken him. The West is about regime change, nevertheless, of what it is saying. Secondly, he does not believe that he's so isolated in the world in the way we believe he is. And to be honest, in a certain way, he has his own arguments for this. And thirdly, while he's very unhappy what is happening on the ground, he still believes that he can turn it. He still believes that what happened in the first 1 month was just bad luck. That with a better performance on the ground, with a stronger military offensive, and this is what we're seeing in Donbass. And in Donbass, we're going to see Russian army performing better than it is performing in the last months. He believes that this is going to change the dynamics. He has not lost the hope that at the end of the day, the game can turn better for him. And this is why he's looking around and he says, okay, the West was unified, true, but for how long? I'm sure that following the elections in France with no less interest than President Macron or Madame Le Pen.
I'm sure you're right, Ivan. I'm sure you're right.
He's also looking at what is happening in the United States and saying, okay, Biden is fighting me. He did things that I didn't expect him to do. I never expected that Americans are going to sanction Russian currency reserves. But what about his approval rating? So from his point of view, he's in the beginning of a war, not at the end of it. And in the case of Ukraine, what remains to him is just incredible resentment. And part of the cruelty that you see is out of this. He's treating Ukrainians as traitors.
Because that's what I wanted to get to. I mean, no, if you say this is the beginning of the war, I mean, perhaps the biggest mistake he made was not about the West. The biggest mistake he made was not about his own military. The biggest mistake he made was this notion that Ukraine was going to welcome him, that the Ukrainians were really Russians in disguise, because, of course, the implication of this war, first and foremost, is that every Ukrainian that imaginable is going to view Russia and Putin as their permanent enemy for generations. And how can you possibly think that that's something that you can suddenly win? It's gotten so much worse for him as a consequence of the invasion.
Totally. And I do believe here he's at his worst, because strangely enough, what is at the heart of his mistake was the experience of Crimea. During the annexation of Crimea,
which was mostly ethnic Russians, by the way.
It wasn't ethnic Russians, but don't forget something critically important. There was 20,000 Ukrainian soldiers, and they didn't fight back. And this idea that Ukrainian people deeply in their hearts are loyal to Russia, but you have this corrupt, pro-Western colonizing elite, which is working for the West. This was how he was perceiving Ukraine, as the Western protectorate and people waiting basically for him to come and to liberate them. And then this totally backfired. There is a story that for me is very powerful to understand also how much Ukraine has changed for the last 7 or 8 years. Because don't forget, 10, 11 years ago, Ukraine was the most Russia-friendly country in the world. You go on the opinion polls, they like Putin, they like Russia. This similarity of language, similarity of culture was there. So Ukraine was not Russia. And
before the 2014 invasion.
Before 2014. And then came 2014, and President Putin always positioned himself as an expert on humiliation. He can talk for hours how humiliated Russia is, but he does not have a sensitivity for humiliating somebody else. And what the Ukrainians experienced in Crimea was not simply the Russians' betrayal, but they were humiliated. There was the story that stayed with me for all these years. Out of all Ukrainian ships that have been basically encircled in Sevastopol, there was only one whose captain said, "We are not going to surrender." And when the Russian ships went around him and said, "But surrender, you don't have a chance," his answer was, "We Russians do never surrender." It was back in 2014. And then you have 2022, and you have the famous story with the Snake Island, where you had this group
Russian
of
warship
Ukrainians,
go
and
after
this time
yourself.
it was
Yes.
Russian ship go to hell. And I do believe for these 7 years, a new Ukrainian nation that have been built, strongly anti-Russian, strongly anti-Putin, and very much kind of a proud with its determination to resist. And he missed the birth of this nation. And this is very funny because he's the father of this nation. This anti-kind of a Russia, Ukraine was very much the result of his actions, but he missed to see it. He was still seeing something that existed before.
He missed it even as there was ongoing fighting with thousands of deaths every day, every week over the Donbass, over the occupied territories and the little green men. I mean, the Ukrainians were resisting. He missed all of that.
He missed all of this because it didn't fit to his deep conviction that the Russian world is a special civilizational space, that all these Russian-speaking people are Russians. He also had incredible dismissal about the Ukrainian state, that this is not a state, that they do not exist, that they cannot perform, that there is very dysfunctional. And part of it is also very much rooted in a very different way the Russians and the Ukrainians experience their states. Russians, even anti-Russian, anti-Putin Russians, has a respect for the vertical of the state. The state should be strong. And the strong state means strong leader. And you basically can disagree who is the good leader, but this is there. And the Ukrainians, it's not by accident that some of the strongest anarchist movements in Europe were very much based in Ukraine. Makhno was in Ukraine. So the idea of state is totally different. First of all, society is stronger than the state. They basically prefer kind of a state which is not trying to oppress. You have this idea of a freedom which is very much against your own state. From this point of view, I have the feeling that Russians, not only Putin, have been historically misreading Ukraine because they're always expecting the Ukraine to view the strengths of the state in the way the Russians do it. This is the most difficult to understand your neighbors. It's more difficult to understand your relatives because you're so sure that they're like you. And then suddenly they realize it's not the case. And now he has also a problem because before, Putin never has ever faced a strong but different leader in opposition to him. For the first time, it happened to Navalny, and to see that he basically had to put him
the opposition leader who's now sitting in jail in Russia, in a labor camp.
And now you have Zelensky, and you should imagine that from Putin's point of view, the fact that now Zelensky has captured the imagination of the world, and he is the rebel leader that everybody is admiring. For him, this is the end of the world because this is a comedian. This is kind of a TV personality. For some Secret Service colonel, there is nothing more dismissive than comedian. And this comedian is not simply capturing the admiration of the world public, but resisting him, fighting him on his own game. So in my view, this is a very transformative period. And there is a lot of intelligence coming from Russia saying that President Putin is permanently angry. I can understand why he's angry. In a certain way, all the world that he has constructed for himself is crumbling down.
So what we're talking about, of course, is two completely different worldviews, two completely different perspectives of what Ukraine is, can be, should be, role of the state, role of the military. I mean, this is obviously not sounding like something that is leading to a climb down, a negotiated settlement, or even a ceasefire and a freeze. So, look, we all know that the Russians have started their so-called second phase, and they intend to take the greater Donbass, which they should have certainly better military capability of doing than going into Kiev. But what happens? Let's assume they get it. Let's assume they are able to take this additional territory. They've got their land bridge to Crimea. But from what I'm hearing you say, Ivan, it's not in any way over then. In other words, this is not 2014 Redux, where they take some more territory and they say, okay, done, now we can have a ceasefire. Where do you think Putin wants this to go?
It has changed. He was first, when it started, by the way, when he said that it's a special operation, he believed it was a special operation. He didn't believe that he's starting a war. He believed it's going to be special operations, very similar to what happened in places like Crimea or before it, what the Soviet Union had been doing in Eastern Bloc. And then basically you're going to unify historic Russia. And suddenly the Ukrainians are fighting back. And not simply fighting back, but they're fighting furiously. And from his point of view, fighting without the hope of winning. And this is why for him, this became a punishment operation. So in a certain way, if you cannot convert, you should punish. There is something really perverse going on. Imagine this is the leader of an Orthodox country, and he started a war against another Slavic Orthodox people, and 2/3 of the Orthodox Slavs in Ukraine were part of the Moscow Church. And he's starting the offensive in the Easter week, before the Easter. Now, all this story that as if somebody has replaced the Ukrainians with some other people, and he's there to transform them and turn them to their senses, all the stories that they're a certain type of zombies, because this is the other story. If you're listening to Russian propaganda, nobody talks about Ukrainians. Russian public does not believe that Russia is fighting Ukrainians. They believe that Russia is fighting NATO or fighting West, basically fighting Americans. And this is also his story. And this is why...
This was when the Moskva, when the flagship carrier was sunk. That wasn't the Ukrainians, that was NATO. That's what you see in the Russian media.
It's, by the way, it was even kind of more absurd, because their first idea was that, of course, it was not sank. It was some accident, it was a fire, but this was a fire, and then they said, but we should retaliate. So the problem of the inconsistency of the Russian propaganda comes from the fact that you cannot really tell the people we're fighting a war with Ukrainians, because the Ukrainians should be Russians. This is why we're there. And then these Russians are fighting for whom? They're fighting for NATO, they're fighting for the West. So my feeling is that he will escalate, and he will escalate for 3 totally different reasons. One is, there is many things that President Putin can live with. There is one thing that he cannot live with, being perceived as weak. The perception of weakness is the curse for any authoritarian leader. Authoritarian leaders can be evil, they can be awful, they can do other things, but the moment when they're perceived as weak, they have a problem.
It's over, yeah. Exactly.
It's over. The second thing, in my view, is that in order to solve this problem, he should make it a bigger problem. Because if you're fighting the West, particularly what he now knows is that nevertheless how the war in Ukraine is going to happen on the ground, even if they're going to be a ceasefire, American financial sanctions are going to stay, not necessarily all European sanctions. And this is a difficult war for him, because this is going to be destructive for his economy. So the only way is to make his own war somebody else's war too. And in my view, the escalation also goes on this. So I'll not be surprised if you're going to see certain type of places of conflict outside of the territory of Ukraine. Not the military operations, but basically try to make the cost higher in order to put pressure also on the West to get the sanctions out of him. And thirdly, in my view, this is also the way what you're doing with the Russian nation at this moment, because there is now consolidation around him. For sure, people are now under the flag. Most of the Russians are buying the narrative that the West tried to weaken Russia and to destroy Russia, and Russia is in self-defense. But this cannot stay forever. He destroyed the life of the middle-class Russians, full stop. These people used to travel, these people used to have businesses, these people believed that they elite in the world. So he nationalized the elite, he closed the country, but unlike the Soviet Union, he closed the country without the promise that the future belongs to Russia. And in my view, this kind of a claustrophobia is something that he's going to face, because you're right, he can get control over Donbass. This is a totally destroyed area. Who's going to rebuild it?
What do you think happens in Russia when Putin, after all of this has transpired, with a permanent break, certainly in the relations with the United States, and active hostility and conflict with NATO, what happens to Russia after Putin?
Listen, it's a great question, and I'm probably not going to surprise you if I tell you that I don't know the answer. But there are several things that probably we should think about when we try to answer this question. Putin basically is preoccupied with demography and Russia's demographic decline. He was repeating recently several times that if it was not for the revolution, if it was not for the World War II, if it was not for the disintegration of the Soviet Union, there are going to be 500 million Russians in the world. But now in Russia, there are less than 145 million people. So this fear of a shrinking population that is populating one of the biggest territories in the world, in my view, this is also hard to understand where all this anxiety comes from. And in my view, this is becoming a problem for Russia itself. And one of the problems with Putin is that he's not allowing basically Russians to talk openly of how post-Putin Russia can look like. If you see what Europeans are talking about, we want an economy that does not rely at all on Russian gas and oil. We basically want to make clear that they're not going to be a movement of people. We want basically reduce the relations. As a result of it, in a certain way, particularly the West starts to dream about the world without Russia.
Yes, certainly the Western world without Russia. Yes.
And in a certain way, now Russia started to dream about the world without West, but Russia was much more part of this Western world than anything else. China is a very reliable and important ally now, but I have not seen many kind of Russians that are culturally attracted by China. It's simply very far. It's very different.
There's no infrastructure. There's very little trade compared to the West. I mean, it's just not there.
Yeah. So from this point of view, paradoxically, the result of all this is that what Russia is getting is a COVID forever, the quarantine. You're staying in your house. You cannot get out. And you have this sense of claustrophobia, and also some of your best people are leaving. If you see how many IT people has left the country for the last 2 or 3 months, this is an issue.
Hundreds of thousands, yeah.
Hundreds of thousands. So in a certain way, you can survive because you're a nuclear power. So you cannot be defeated in conventional terms. But then you're a country which cannot even dreaming about your own future. And this is a problem. By the way, it's a problem for the West, not only for Russia. I do believe that we also lost the capacity to imagine a different Russia. I do believe that different Russia is probably possible, but this is the Putin effect. While the Soviet leaders wanted their mummified bodies to be put in the mausoleum, I do believe that Putin succeeded to mummify the body of Russia itself.
Ivan Krastev, powerful words to close our conversation. Thanks a lot. I hope you're wrong.
Thank you.
That's it for today's edition of the GZERO World Podcast. Like what you've heard? Come check us out at gzeromedia.com and sign up for our newsletter, Signal.
The GZERO World Podcast is brought to you by our founding sponsor, First Republic. First Republic, a private bank and wealth management company, understands the value of service, safety, and stability in today's uncertain world. Visit firstrepublic.com to learn more. GZERO World would also like to share a message from our friends at Foreign Policy. Challenge yourself to change the world. On Season 3 of Course Correction, a podcast from Doha Debates in partnership with the UNHCR Refugee Agency, host Nelifur Hedayet takes listeners on the journey of a refugee. From the moment of displacement to mental health risks to integration and assimilation, learn about the issues affecting displaced persons around the world and what you can do to solve them. Follow and listen to Course Correction wherever you get your podcasts.
You're listening to the GZERO World with Ian Bremmer podcast, your weekly geopolitical deep dive into the world's biggest news stories, featuring in-depth conversations with global leaders and newsmakers. To get more of GZERO's insights on global politics every morning, sign up for our free newsletter, GZERO Daily, at gzeromedia.com.